A roar of motorcycle engines shattered the morning silence. I jumped up, rushing out to the porch, my eyes fixed on the motorcycles speeding past my property. They didn't stop, instead veering onto the trail near the lake. My hands clenched instinctively, and I could feel the tension creeping through the air. Before I could think further, I saw them toss large garbage bags into the lake. Not just any bags, but ones filled with pesticide bottles, herbicide containers. They plunged into the water as if trying to poison the very lake I had called home for years. Anger surged within me. I couldn't believe anyone would do something like this. I hurried to the lake's edge, barely noticing the dust rising from the departing bikes. The liquid in the shattered bottles spread out a greenish hue, slowly covering the water's surface, an unmistakable contamination. At that moment, I noticed something even worse. Fish and other creatures beneath the lake began to float to the surface, dead fish, swollen bellies, cloudy eyes, silently drifting in the water. The foul stench of decay spread through the air. Who is behind this, and can I stop it before it's too late? I'm not one to stir up trouble. Besides, I'd had enough of administrative meetings after my years in the military. But this, I couldn't let slide. A few days after the trash bag incident, Karen Delaney, the HOA president, showed up. She drove her familiar golf cart, a wide-brimmed hat on her head, her face always smiling, but cold, as if everything was under her control. She stopped right in front of my house, stepping out in her shiny high heels, moving slowly but with purpose, and I knew she wasn't here to chat. "Hello, Mr. Avery. I think it's time we had a talk about this property," Karen started, her tone light but full of underlying authority. "This lake isn't just for one person, and there are some very clear rules you might not be aware of." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but her words felt like a veiled threat. She wasn't just trying to control the lake. She was trying to take my rights. I wasn't one to be easily fooled, nor easily manipulated. I've lived here for 6 years, and I've had my legal documents checked. "My property still stands separate with lake access rights," I replied, my voice steady but firm. She smiled, but her eyes remained devoid of emotion. "Oh, I understand. But according to HOA policy, all lakeside properties must adhere to environmental protection regulations. And I'm afraid—" She paused as if choosing her next words carefully. "You must have noticed a few changes in the rules, haven't you?" Karen pointed to the new signs posted along the lake shore, with big letters stating, "No access to the lake without HOA approval." She continued her persuasive speech, but I knew it wasn't about rules or environmental protection, as she claimed. This was about power. And Karen wouldn't stop until I was out of the picture. She wasn't just after my land. She wanted to destroy everything I had built, piece by piece. Things started to change gradually, as if an unannounced storm was approaching. After my meeting with Karen, I thought everything had calmed down. Just a week ago, my life was peaceful, the lake was still clear, and the sky still wide open. But since Karen's appearance, everything started slipping out of control. One morning, while I was fixing a loose plank on the dock, I suddenly noticed a strange footprint on the ground near my property. At first, I thought it was just a passerby, but as I looked closer, I saw tire tracks deep in the grass, near the lakeshore tracks that seemed to stretch all the way to my property line. These weren't random marks. Someone had been watching me from a distance. When I saw those strange marks, an uneasy feeling crept in. I walked past them and went on with my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being prepared. Soon enough, Karen appeared again, driving her familiar golf cart, clipboard in hand, her face filled with a serious expression. She didn't seem in a hurry, but I knew she was keeping an eye on me. She stopped right at my gate, stepped out of the cart, and gave me that fake smile, the one I had started to see all too often. "Hello, Mr. Avery. I think it's time we had a talk about this property." Karen began, her tone light, but with an underlying threat. "This lake isn't just for one person, and there are some very clear rules you might not be aware of." I said nothing. There was no need. She knew I was well aware of the rules. I had checked my documents and the laws long ago. I simply replied coldly, "I've lived here for over 6 years and my property is fully legal. I have the right to use this lake." But Karen wouldn't let go. She just smiled her smile that I had begun to find all too familiar, a smile filled with power. "Oh, I understand. But according to HOA policy, all lakeside properties must adhere to environmental protection regulations. And I'm afraid—" She paused, then continued, "You must have noticed a few changes in the rules, haven't you?" She was referring to the new signs posted along the lake shore, with large letters saying, "No access to the lake without HOA approval." These signs, though seemingly reasonable, were a strategy by Karen to control everything. I couldn't let her get away with it. Just when I thought everything might settle down, strange signs began appearing again. One morning I woke up early to fix a few loose boards on the dock. Everything was quiet until I noticed something unusual. The first bag of trash appeared. Not the usual bags, but ones filled with pesticide bottles, herbicide containers, things that could harm not just the lake, but the surrounding land. The bottles were shattered, and the liquid inside began to spill out on the water, a greenish hue spreading across the surface. The smell of chemicals filled the air. I pulled the bags out of the lake and dragged them to shore. The liquid inside spread, forming strange green streaks. Karen had no response when I emailed HOA about the incident. Just like I feared, it didn't end there. 3 days later, another bag appeared not near the dock, but further inland near my fence. This bag was filled with hard materials, and there was something inside I couldn't immediately identify, but the smell of rotting meat started to fill the air. I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I decided to install a surveillance camera near the shoreline to monitor any suspicious activity. The next night I woke up to check the camera. When I opened the video, what I saw made my heart stop. The camera had been cut, cleaned, the wires severed neatly, as if someone knew exactly where I had hidden the device. No one admitted to it. I was being watched. Every time I thought about what had happened, I felt a growing sense of invisible fear closing in around me. It wasn't just Karen. Maybe there were more people in HOA involved in these actions. Karen wasn't just after my lake, she was trying to break me, to make me lose control over my life. She was using every tool in her arsenal to destroy the peace I had built over the years. Each day I felt more and more that this fight wasn't just about my rights, but about power. I couldn't just sit back and let Karen continue manipulating everything. This lake wasn't just property to me, it was my life, and I would protect it at all costs. Things had escalated beyond just trash bags. After receiving Karen's letter, I felt like everything was going too far. She wasn't simply trying to control a piece of land, it seemed she was gradually encroaching on everything I held dear. This lake wasn't just a place I found peace. It was my memory, it was part of my life, and now it seemed Karen and the HOA wanted to take it all. After the first threatening letter, I began noticing a significant change in my environment. I no longer just saw HOA's warning signs along the lakeshore, but I started noticing strange markings on my land. One morning when I woke up early to check the dock area, I discovered tire tracks deeply imprinted on the ground, stretching all the way to my property line. They weren't the marks of a casual walker. They were the tracks of a truck. That afternoon, as I was fixing a few boards on the dock, I saw a navy blue pickup truck parked near my land. The truck stopped, then flashed its headlights, lighting up the area. A man in a black jacket stepped out of the truck bed, opened the back, and pulled out large trash bags. He hurriedly dragged the bags toward the lake, as if trying to hide his actions. Although I was only a few meters away, he didn't realize I was watching. At that moment, I couldn't stand by any longer. Karen hadn't stopped. She was still using these underhanded tactics to force me out of the land I had lived on for years. I couldn't just stand idly by and let it happen. I stepped off the dock, trying to remain calm. But as I got closer, the navy blue truck had already started backing up, preparing to turn. I couldn't get a good look at the license plate, but I did notice something odd. The trash bags weren't just regular garbage. Inside there were toxic materials, pesticide bottles, herbicide containers, harmful substances that could destroy not just the lake, but the surrounding environment. I knew I couldn't let these materials get into the water any further. Right after that, I decided to call a friend from the environmental protection team, asking him to come over and inspect the area. I didn't just want to clean up the mess. I needed evidence in case I had to take HOA to court. But as I was preparing everything, I noticed something else disturbing. A strange woman appeared near the lake, her face anxious, as if she was watching me. I couldn't say anything, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The next day, I installed a surveillance camera near the shoreline. I carefully hid it in one of the large branches nearby, ensuring it could capture the entire shoreline area and the land behind it, where I frequently found suspicious activities. This time, I didn't just set up one camera. I also added a motion sensor device to detect any movement at night. I felt like something bigger was happening behind Karen's actions. A week later, things became more serious. More than once, I found new bags of trash appearing not near the dock, but further into my property right next to my fence. I couldn't help but think that someone was deliberately placing them in sensitive spots, places I couldn't control entirely. One night, I saw the navy blue truck again. But this time I didn't just see a truck. I also saw Karen driving her golf cart, stopping right outside my property looking at the lake. She acted like she didn't see me, but I knew she was checking the situation, just like all the previous actions she had taken. I walked closer and saw a large trash bag near the shoreline. I quickly pulled it up and checked. Inside were dozens of bottles of pesticides and herbicides, the same items I had seen before. This only confirmed one thing: Karen and HOA had a long-term plan to force me out of this land. She wasn't just after my property. She was trying to ruin my reputation and erase any trace of my ownership. The next morning, I decided I could no longer take a step back. I installed more cameras around my land and began recording everything suspicious near the lake. I needed solid evidence because I knew Karen wouldn't stop until I had nothing left. One day I saw the navy blue truck again. This time I didn't just see one man in a black jacket dumping trash into the lake. I saw Karen herself driving her golf cart, stopping again right outside my property, and stepping out to stare directly at the lake area. She was acting like she didn't see me, but I knew she was monitoring the situation. Things were no longer just about trash bags or warning signs. After receiving Karen's first threatening letter, I began to realize that everything was spiraling out of control. It was no longer just a property dispute. It had become a battle between me and a force that was trying to wipe out everything I cherished. This lake wasn't just part of my property. It was part of my memories, part of the life I had built, and now it seemed that Karen and the HOA wanted to take it all. After the first threatening letter, I began to notice a significant shift in my surroundings. I didn't just see HOA warning signs posted along the lakeshore, but I also started noticing strange traces on my property. One morning, when I woke up early to check the dock area, I discovered tire tracks deeply imprinted on the ground, stretching all the way to the land near my fence. They weren't the tracks of casual pedestrians, they were the traces of a pickup truck. That afternoon, while I was repairing a few boards on the dock, I suddenly saw a navy blue pickup truck parked near my land. The truck stopped and turned on its headlights, illuminating the entire area. A man in a black jacket stepped out of the truck bed, opened the back, and pulled out large trash bags. He hastily dragged the bags toward the lake, cautious, as if afraid someone might see him. Although I was only a few meters away, he didn't realize I was watching. At that moment, I couldn't stand it anymore. Karen hadn't stopped. She was still using these underhanded tactics to force me off the land where I had lived my entire life. I couldn't just stand by and wait for things to unfold the way Karen wanted. I decided I had to act. I stepped off the dock, trying to remain calm. But as I got closer, the navy blue truck began reversing, preparing to turn around. I didn't get a clear look at the license plate, but I immediately realized something was very off. These trash bags weren't just regular trash. Inside, there were toxic materials, pesticide bottles, herbicides, chemicals that could destroy not just the lake but the entire surrounding environment. I knew right away that I couldn't let these things float into the water any longer. Immediately, I decided to call a friend of mine in the environmental protection team, asking him to come and inspect the situation. I didn't just want to clean up the mess. I wanted evidence so I could take the HOA to court if needed. But while I was preparing everything, I noticed something else that troubled me. A strange woman appeared near the lake with a hurried expression, as if she were watching me. I couldn't say anything, but the feeling of being watched became more palpable. The next day, I installed a surveillance camera near the lakeshore. I carefully hid it in one of the large branches nearby, ensuring it could record the entire lakeshore area and the land behind it where I had frequently noticed strange activities. However, this time I didn't just install one camera. I also set up a motion sensor device to detect any movement at night. I felt like there was something much bigger going on behind Karen's actions. A week later, things got even more serious. More than once, I discovered new trash bags not near the dock, like before, but further into my land right by the fence. I couldn't help but think that someone was deliberately placing them in sensitive spots, places I couldn't fully monitor. One late night, I saw the navy blue truck again. But this time, I didn't just see a truck. I also saw Karen driving her golf cart, stopping right outside my land and stepping down, staring at the lake area. She acted like she didn't see me, but I knew she was monitoring the situation, just like she had done with all her previous actions. I walked closer and found a large trash bag lying near the shoreline. I quickly pulled it up and checked. Inside were dozens of pesticide and herbicide bottles that I had seen before. This further confirmed one thing: Karen and the HOA had a long-term plan to force me off this land. She didn't just want me to leave. She was doing everything she could to discredit me and erase every trace of my ownership. The next morning, I decided I could no longer back down. I installed more cameras around my property and began recording every suspicious movement in the lakeshore area. I needed clear evidence because I knew Karen wouldn't stop until I had nothing left. One day I saw the navy blue truck again. This time, I didn't just notice a man in a black jacket dumping trash into the lake. I also noticed strange actions from people within the HOA. They were filming the lakeshore area of my property as if recording an incident of trespassing. I couldn't stay silent any longer. I decided I had to confront Karen and the HOA immediately. The day after I confronted Karen by the lake, the atmosphere around me felt different, heavier. I couldn't ignore the fact that everything was escalating beyond the confines of my property. This wasn't just about a few rogue actions anymore. This had grown into a full-fledged environmental disaster with legal and social consequences that could no longer be ignored. I woke up to the sounds of sirens early that morning. At first I thought it was just another routine disturbance in the neighborhood, maybe a police car passing by. But as I looked outside, I saw a fleet of vehicles parked along the road near my house. There were 2 county sheriff SUVs, a white environmental inspection van, and a small blue sedan that looked official enough to make my stomach drop. The signs were unmistakable. Something serious was about to unfold, and it involved official authorities. I rushed out of the house and walked toward the front yard. By now, I was already prepared mentally for the confrontation. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing as I spotted Jeff stepping out of the white van. He gave me a quick nod and gestured for me to come over. "Tom," Jeff said, his voice firm but calm, "we've got confirmation. The county's environmental department is getting involved now. This isn't just about your property anymore. We have a full investigation on our hands." I swallowed hard. "What does that mean? What happens next?" "We're going to take immediate samples from the lake," he explained. "The authorities are also going to conduct a thorough inspection of everything, the ground, the water, and all evidence. It's escalating fast." Before I could process what he was saying, Karen appeared in her golf cart, moving slowly but deliberately toward the growing group of officials. Her face, usually composed, now had a tight, anxious expression. She waved briefly at the group, but didn't approach. She stood at a distance watching everything unfold, her hands tightly, gripping the steering wheel of the cart. I could see the desperation in her eyes. She had no control over the situation anymore, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down on her. I walked over to the officials, and one of the sheriff's deputies, a tall man with a gruff voice, introduced himself. "We're here to conduct a full investigation," he said. "We've received numerous complaints about pollution in this area. Given your documentation, we'll start with the water testing and move on to the surrounding property." The inspection process was meticulous as expected. The authorities set up a command center near the shore. They worked quickly, but with great attention to detail, taking water samples, measuring chemical concentrations, and recording everything. As they moved, I felt like I was being left behind, powerless. Karen's presence remained like a shadow hovering near the golf cart. She didn't seem to have a word to say to anyone. I could see her checking her phone constantly, likely gathering information on her next move. My eyes locked with hers a few times, but she didn't speak to me. There was something about the way she held herself like a predator waiting for her next strike. But today, she didn't have the power. I did. Just then, one of the deputies approached me. "Mr. Avery, we've got an issue," he said. "There's a breach in the property boundary line. Based on the deed you've provided and the initial investigations, it seems there has been unauthorized activity, not just here, but in other areas of the neighborhood as well. Karen and the HOA may have been using this land for personal gain." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had suspected something was off, but hearing it confirmed by the authorities hit differently. Karen had been manipulating the system, and now the full weight of her actions was coming to light. She wasn't just a petty HOA president. She was running a covert operation that affected more than just my land. "Do you have any proof of this?" I asked, my voice steady, but my mind reeling from the enormity of the situation. "We're still investigating, but the physical evidence matches up with your claims. That's why we're conducting a complete audit on the HOA's activities. We'll be questioning her next." As I looked back at Karen, I realized she had nowhere left to run. Her carefully crafted image of control and respectability was falling apart. The police, the sheriff, the environmental inspectors, they were all closing in, and she couldn't handle it. A few hours later, the testing was done, and the results were preliminary but damning. The lake had been contaminated with multiple chemical pollutants, including oils, pesticides, and herbicides, the very same chemicals I had found in the trash bags. But the real shocker came when they revealed that the land behind my property had been tampered with as well. The sheriff turned to me. "Mr. Avery, we've uncovered tampering of boundary markers. The HOA manipulated property lines to make it appear as though they had rights to your land. We'll be issuing a formal complaint against Karen Delaney and the HOA for environmental negligence, fraud, and misuse of community funds." The severity of their findings hit me like a ton of bricks. Not only had Karen tried to seize my property through legal manipulation, but she had also endangered the entire ecosystem in the process. This wasn't just a personal vendetta anymore. This was the destruction of something vital, and I would do whatever it took to stop her. The days following the investigation were tense, as if the neighborhood had become a ticking time bomb waiting for the final spark. The authorities had confirmed the full extent of the damage, and now it was no longer just about the lake. This was about Karen's downfall, and it was clear the HOA was collapsing under the weight of its own lies and manipulation. But Karen hadn't given up yet. She was too arrogant, too desperate to maintain control. I had a feeling she was planning something. The HOA had already taken a hit with the environmental inspection, but Karen was still pulling strings behind the scenes. I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead of us. It wasn't long before I received a phone call from Jeff. His voice was tense-clipped. "Tom, we've got a problem. We've just gotten word that Karen has made her move. She's rallying the HOA board to hold an emergency meeting tonight. They're planning to vote on an emergency proposal to claim exclusive rights to the lake without even considering the damage or the illegal activities they've committed." I froze. It was happening again. Karen was trying to take control in the only way she knew how, by using her power to manipulate the system. "This is it," Jeff continued. "She's pushing for an emergency ruling to make it look like the HOA is still in charge of the lake, to create a legal loophole that could prevent anyone from challenging her actions." My stomach twisted. This was her last-ditch effort to salvage the power she had lost. The HOA was making a last stand, and if they succeeded, it would be my worst nightmare. A corrupt system that could continue to destroy the environment and maintain its grip on the community. I didn't waste another second. I called the local sheriff's office, the EPA, and even reached out to the local news station. If Karen thought she could just hold a clandestine meeting and win, she was gravely mistaken. This time she wasn't getting away with it. By the time the emergency HOA meeting started that night, I had already gathered every bit of evidence I could: drone footage, chemical samples, testimony from Jeff and the environmental team. I was ready to take the fight to them, and I wasn't backing down. The community center, where the meeting was being held, was packed. I could see the nervous faces of neighbors, people who had once been passive, now looking for answers. Sandra from down the street nodded at me as I walked in, her expression grim but supportive. She knew what this was about. Lyle, the vice president of the HOA, was sitting near the front, shifting in his seat like he had something to hide. And then, of course, there was Karen, sitting confidently at the head of the table, trying her best to appear composed. But I could see the cracks in her facade. She was starting to realize that her empire was crumbling, and she was desperate to hold on to what was left. As I stood at the back of the room, I heard her voice ring out, addressing the crowd. She was trying to regain her authority, her power, with the same tired rhetoric. "We're here tonight because we need to protect Willow Glen Estates from the chaos that is threatening our community. The lake, our lake, is an essential part of our neighborhood. We cannot allow someone to disrupt the peace and harmony we've worked so hard to build." The room was dead silent. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, and interrupted her. "Peace," I said, my voice low but steady. "You call poisoning our lake and trying to steal my land peace. This isn't about protecting anyone. It's about greed. It's about power." Karen's eyes flashed with anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about, Tom." "Actually, I do," I replied, my voice rising. "I know exactly what's going on. I've been collecting evidence, real evidence, and it's all about to come out." The room murmured, and Karen tried to regain control, but she could see the crowd beginning to turn against her. I continued. "The EPA, the sheriff, and the environmental inspection team are already aware of your illegal actions. We know about the chemical waste, the toxic runoff, and how you've been using HOA resources to cover up your crimes." A hushed silence fell over the room. People exchanged glances, some nervous, some supportive. But Karen, instead of backing down, rose from her seat, her face flushed with rage. "This is slander," she shouted. "None of this is true. This man is trying to destroy everything we've worked for. Don't listen to him." I ignored her, and instead I walked over to the front, pulling out a stack of official documents and evidence files. I handed them to the board members, making sure everyone in the room could see them. I could feel Karen's eyes boring into me, but I wasn't backing down now. "Here's the truth," I said, "and it's all documented. From the toxic chemicals dumped into the lake, to the forged boundary lines and manipulated property deeds, this is all on record. You're not fooling anyone anymore, Karen." The board members looked through the evidence. Their faces shifted from confusion to realization, some of them even looking at Karen with doubt in their eyes. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. The board, many of them silently siding with me, began to murmur amongst themselves. Then came the tipping point. A deputy sheriff who had been present for the meeting stood up. "Karen Delaney," he said, his voice booming, "you're under investigation for environmental crimes, fraud, and abuse of power. The county will be issuing formal charges, and will need you to step aside immediately." Karen's face turned pale. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She looked defeated, and for a brief moment I saw her guard drop. The battle was over. Karen had lost. She turned to leave, but not before casting one final venomous glare at me. As she walked out, the room erupted into applause. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out now found their voices. The HOA's reign of fear was over. The next morning, the sheriff's department sealed the HOA office. The news coverage exploded across local media, and for the first time, I felt like I was standing on the right side of history. The day of the HOA meeting felt like the calm before the storm. As I walked into the community center, the air was thick with tension. The chairs were filled, people whispering amongst themselves, all wondering what would unfold. I didn't want to be here, didn't want to be the one standing at the front with the weight of the neighborhood's future on my shoulders. But this was my fight, and I wasn't going to back down now. Karen was seated at the head of the room, her posture stiff, her fingers lightly tapping on the table. The members of the HOA board sat beside her, eyes darting around uncertain. They knew things were bad, but they hadn't fully realized how deep the hole was. The meeting began, and Karen launched into her usual speech about the integrity of the neighborhood, how the HOA was trying to protect the community from the disruptions I had caused. Her voice was smooth, practiced, but there was a tremor beneath the surface. She could feel the cracks just as I could. Her charm was slipping. I stood up, walking to the front of the room with the evidence stacked in my hands, photographs, emails, environmental reports. I set it all down on the table, making sure every eye in the room could see the evidence I was about to present. "I'm not here to argue," I began, my voice clear, unwavering. "I'm here to show you the truth." I pulled out the video footage first, the clips showing Karen's golf cart parked near my land, the illegal dumping of chemicals into the lake, the trash bags filled with pesticide bottles. I watched as people in the crowd shifted in their seats, their gazes flicking nervously from the footage to Karen. "This is your HOA, Karen," I continued, pointing at the screen. "These are your actions. These are the chemicals you've been dumping into the lake. This isn't just a personal dispute anymore. This is about environmental destruction." A murmur ran through the room. Some people looked ashamed, some looked scared, but all were listening. Karen's facade cracked. She tried to regain control, but the words seemed to falter on her tongue. "This is nonsense," Karen spat, her voice shaking with anger. "You're trying to ruin everything we've built here. This is a smear campaign." She turned to the board, her face twisted with rage. "Don't listen to him. This is a man trying to ruin our community. He's gone rogue." But I wasn't about to let her deflect. I turned to the sheriff's deputy, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room. I knew this was the moment. "Officer, would you like to explain to Karen what happens when you break the law?" I asked calmly. The sheriff stood up, his voice steady. "Karen Delaney, you are under investigation for environmental violations, fraud, and abuse of your position as HOA president. Based on the evidence presented today, we are proceeding with a formal investigation. You will be placed under arrest." The room went silent. Karen's face drained of color. She stumbled back her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't do this," she whispered, but there was no more confidence in her voice. It was over. The sheriff's deputy moved toward her, his hand extended to cuff her, and Karen took a step back, her eyes wild with fear. "You're making a mistake." She cried, but it was too late. The evidence was clear, and she had no defense left. "Karen Delaney, you are under arrest," the deputy said firmly. As she was escorted out of the room, her shoulders slumped, and I could feel the weight lift from my chest. The community had won, and Karen had lost. There was no more doubt. The clap of handcuffs and the sound of Karen's protest were drowned out by the applause from the neighbors. This wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for everyone who had stood up for what was right. The room buzzed with voices, the tension of months of fighting finally breaking. The corrupt reign of Karen and the HOA was over. The people of Willow Glen Estates had taken back their power. The applause from the community was still ringing in my ears when the weight of the situation truly settled in. Karen was being led out of the room, her attempts to regain control now nothing more than a faint echo in the distance. But as satisfying as her arrest was, it wasn't enough. I wasn't just going to sit back and let this be a victory without consequences. I had the evidence, and now was the time to lay it all out. I stepped forward once more, this time with even more physical proof, the documents that had been painstakingly gathered over weeks, months. I needed the full weight of this situation to sink in. Everyone needed to see it for themselves, how deep the corruption went, how much damage Karen and the HOA had caused, not just to my property, but to the entire community and the environment. What Karen did isn't just a personal attack on me, I said, my voice clear, unwavering. This is environmental terrorism, and I have the proof. I unrolled a map of the neighborhood and pointed to a spot near the lake. This is where Karen's scheme started. The illegal dumping, the manipulated property lines, the falsified documents, this is what they didn't want you to see. The board members shuffled nervously as I pulled out a series of photos from my phone, showing the toxic runoff flowing into the lake, barrels of pesticide dumped near the shoreline, and evidence of forged boundary lines that Karen had manipulated to make it appear as if she had ownership of areas she didn't. The shock on the board members' faces was unmistakable. One of them, an older woman with glasses, looked like she was about to speak, but she couldn't find the words. I laid out the next piece of evidence, a video recording from the security camera I had set up. The footage showed Karen's golf cart pulling up, her getting out, and the dumping of bags filled with chemicals right into the water. The camera caught everything, the illegal activity, the exact moment she tipped the bags into the lake. It was clear as day. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial, it was damning. I passed the footage around, allowing everyone in the room to see it on their own screens. You could hear the collective gasps from the crowd, the murmurs of disbelief. People were starting to understand just how far Karen had gone to cover her tracks. Then came the official environmental reports. I had called in favors, worked my connections, and now I held in my hands the formal analysis. The lake had been poisoned. Pesticides, heavy metals, and even industrial chemicals had leached into the water, and the evidence was irrefutable. The scientists had even marked the exact locations where the chemicals had been dumped, including areas near the HOA's maintenance shed, which was under Karen's jurisdiction. This wasn't a mistake. This was a calculated effort to destroy the ecosystem. And it didn't stop there. I held up the most damning piece of evidence, an email exchange between Karen and one of the contractors she had hired. The contractor had admitted in writing to disposing of toxic waste illegally under Karen's orders. The email even included instructions to use HOA vehicles to transport the waste. It was clear now that Karen had used the resources and authority of the HOA to perpetuate her schemes. I didn't need to say much. The room had gone completely silent. All eyes were on the evidence, and there was no denying the truth anymore. The destruction of the lake, the manipulation of the community, the fraudulent actions, it was all right in front of them. Karen's defense had crumbled. She had no more lies to tell, no more spin to put on her actions. The community could see everything for what it was, a calculated, malicious attempt to take control of something that didn't belong to her. But the best twist came when I saw the sheriff's deputy glance at his phone. He stepped forward with an unreadable expression and addressed the room. "We've just received an update. After reviewing all the evidence, the county attorney's office is pressing charges. Not just against Karen Delaney, but the entire HOA board is under investigation for fraud, misuse of community funds, and environmental violations." The weight of the statement hit like a wave. The room was stunned. The remaining board members shifted uncomfortably, some even exchanging worried looks. Karen and her entire board are now facing serious criminal charges. The deputy continued, his voice cold but resolute. "The investigations are just beginning, and this will not be swept under the rug." Karen's face fell. The fight she had so desperately clung to was over. The damage had been done, and now the authorities were going to hold her accountable, just as the community had demanded. The moment of truth had arrived, and Karen had nothing left to say. She had been exposed, her actions laid bare for all to see. It was over, and the community had won. The shock in the room was palpable. For the first time since the nightmare began, I saw Karen's control slipping completely. She stood frozen, her eyes darting around the room, as if looking for a way out, but there was no escape. She was cornered, and this time there was no way to manipulate her way out of it. The deputy moved toward Karen with a quiet but determined step, his hand reaching out to cuff her. She backed away, her face twisting with panic. For the first time, Karen was vulnerable. The arrogant, manipulative woman who had spent months poisoning the lake and terrorizing the community was finally being held accountable. "You can't do this," Karen cried, her voice cracking as she tried to take a step back. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is all lies." She reached out to grab the nearest chair, her hands trembling, but it was clear she was losing her grip. One of the other board members, a woman I had never seen stand up for anything before, hesitantly stood and took a step toward Karen. "Karen, it's over," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "We all knew something wasn't right. This isn't just about the lake. It's about the damage we've all caused." Karen turned toward her, her face contorted in anger. "You've all betrayed me," she shouted, her voice shrill. "You have no idea what I've done for this community." But there was no more sympathy, no more room for manipulation. The truth was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming. The community had spoken, and the authorities had acted. With the sheriff's deputies standing beside her, Karen was officially arrested and escorted out of the room, her face flushed with humiliation. The room was dead silent, save for the soft sound of footsteps as she was led away. For the first time in months, I felt a deep sense of relief. But that wasn't the end. As Karen was forced to leave, a shift occurred in the room. The HOA board members, once her loyal followers, now had no defense. Lyle, the vice president who had tried to sit quietly through it all, finally broke the silence. I didn't know it would go this far," he said in a small, remorseful voice. "We were just following orders, but we never should have let it get to this point." Sandra, the woman who had quietly worked behind the scenes, stood up beside him. "Lyle, we're all to blame. We turned a blind eye, and now we're paying for it. But Karen, she's the one who pushed us into this." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The tide had fully turned. The HOA was no longer a monolith of power. It had become a house of cards, collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. I stepped forward, feeling the weight of everything I had fought for finally coming to fruition. "It's not just about Karen," I said, my voice cutting through the tension in the room. "This isn't just about the lake. It's about accountability. It's about standing up when things aren't right, no matter the cost." I turned to the board members. "You can't hide behind her anymore. You need to take responsibility for what you've done." Lyle and the others nodded, their faces pale with guilt. They knew they had no choice but to face the consequences now. The community was watching, and there was nowhere to hide. With Karen arrested and the HOA board members exposed, the sheriff's deputies began reading their rights aloud. The room felt oddly still, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. But there was nothing more to say. The final blow came when the deputy addressed the room again, this time speaking to everyone, not just Karen. "We will be investigating all of the HOA's actions from financial mismanagement to environmental violations," the deputy said. "Any member who participated in this will be held accountable. The evidence has been documented, and it's only a matter of time before charges are filed." The room was filled with murmurs, but this time, they weren't fearful murmurs. They were relieved, hopeful murmurs. The system that had been used to control them was finally breaking down. As Karen was escorted out of the building, she turned to look one last time, her eyes wild with rage and desperation. "This isn't over," she shouted. "I will make sure you all regret this." But the damage had already been done. The community had seen the truth, and there was no going back. The neighborhood was free from her grasp. I stood there, watching as the doors closed behind her, knowing that this was the beginning of something new. Something that would take time to heal, but would be better for it. The HOA was done. The meeting had ended, but the stillness that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The weight of months of tension was suddenly lifted, replaced by an almost palpable sense of relief that spread through the room like a ripple across water. As the sheriff's deputy led Karen out in cuffs, I stood frozen for a moment, taking it all in. The people who had once feared her, who had once cowered under her control, were now free to speak, free to breathe. And for the first time in months, I felt my chest expand with a deep, full breath of peace. The room was filled with murmurs, but they weren't the fearful, hesitant murmurs of before. These were voices of hope, of a new beginning. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stood up, shaking hands, exchanging smiles, and nodding at each other like they were reconnecting after years of silence. The familiar faces I had seen from across the street for so long now had a new light in their eyes. They weren't just residents anymore. They were community. Sandra, who had quietly supported me through it all, made her way over to me with tears in her eyes. She placed a hand on my shoulder and squeezed it. "We did it, Tom. We really did it." Her words felt like a release, a celebration of everything we had fought for. I could see in the eyes of the others a growing sense of unity, a feeling that the battle wasn't just mine, but theirs too. I had fought for the lake for my home, but they had stood beside me silently but firmly, waiting for the moment when they could finally speak up. We had all fought together, even if we hadn't always known it. I looked around the room and felt something shift inside me. The fear I had carried for so long, that nagging feeling that we were powerless, was finally gone. The lake would recover, the community would rebuild, and I could finally let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had been oppressed, for everyone who had felt the sting of injustice. It was proof that change was possible, that even in the face of corruption and manipulation, the truth could win. And we had just proven that. The applause that erupted around me wasn't just for the community's triumph, it was for the freedom we had just reclaimed. In the weeks that followed the arrest, things moved quickly. The community, still buzzing with relief and renewed hope, began to see the full weight of Karen's actions come to light. What had once felt like an isolated feud between me and her was now a full-blown legal and environmental disaster, with consequences far beyond anything any of us could have imagined. It started with the charges. As the legal proceedings unfolded, it became clear that Karen's list of offenses was long, and it wasn't just about her manipulation of HOA rules or the damage she had caused to my property. She was now facing multiple counts of fraud, environmental violations, and misuse of community funds. But the most shocking of all was the charge of intentional environmental destruction. The state's Environmental Protection Agency had confirmed that Karen's actions, specifically the illegal dumping of hazardous chemicals into the lake, had caused long-term damage to the ecosystem, affecting wildlife, plant life, and the water itself. It wasn't just a violation, it was a crime against nature. The more I learned, the more I realized just how deeply Karen had gone in her pursuit of control. The financial mismanagement of the HOA under her leadership was staggering. She had funneled large sums of money into private contractors to carry out illegal activities, like the dumping of toxic waste, and had covered her tracks by falsifying financial records. The sheer scale of the corruption made me sick to my stomach. It wasn't just about the lake. It was about her greed, her power, and the years of manipulation she had woven into the fabric of this community. But the consequences didn't stop with her. The board members, those who had enabled her actions and turned a blind eye to the illegal activities, were also implicated. Lyle, the former vice president, was questioned about his role in signing off on fake property documents and misappropriating funds. The other members were also under investigation for their roles in either facilitating or ignoring Karen's actions. One by one, the board members fell under scrutiny. They had all participated in a long-running conspiracy to cover up the environmental damage and defraud the residents. They thought they could protect her, but now they were all being exposed for their complicity. The sheriff's department began to investigate the HOA's finances, and it wasn't long before a pattern of embezzlement and misappropriation of funds came to light. Karen had used the HOA as a tool for personal gain, and now everyone who had worked with her had to face the music. As the legal proceedings continued, it became clear that Karen's arrest was only the beginning. The case was snowballing into something far larger than I had ever anticipated. The community was owed restitution, and the authorities were working to ensure the damage to the lake was repaired. The state had already begun the process of environmental remediation, sending teams to collect water samples, assess the soil, and begin the long process of healing the ecosystem. Heavy fines were imposed on the HOA for their role in the pollution, and the money would be used to fund the cleanup efforts. The lake was not just going to be restored to its previous state, it was going to be protected from further damage, and the community would have a say in how that happened. For me, the most satisfying part of this process was knowing that Karen would not get away with it. The consequences of her actions were catching up to her, and it wasn't just her reputation that was on the line. The long-term legal battles would ensure that she would be held accountable for what she had done. She couldn't escape the reality that she had destroyed lives, damaged the environment, and betrayed a community that had trusted her. The legal fight was still ongoing, but I knew one thing for sure: Karen would not walk away unscathed. The law would make sure of that, and the community, once shattered, was finally healing. The day Karen's downfall truly began was the day the community saw her for what she really was: a manipulator, a liar, and a criminal. After weeks of mounting pressure, it became clear that there was no escape for her. The authorities, armed with irrefutable evidence, began to move swiftly, and the entire HOA board, once her loyal protectors, was crumbling. As I walked into the community center for the next town hall meeting, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Gone was the fear that had previously gripped the neighborhood. Now there was only determination, and for the first time in months, I felt truly free. The meeting room was packed. Residents sat with their arms crossed, eyes fixed on the front of the room, waiting for the next piece of the story to unfold. The deputy, now fully entrenched in the investigation, stood up to address the room. His voice was calm but firm, as he detailed the evidence, the charges, and what was to come. Karen Delaney and the members of the HOA have been under investigation for months, he began, his words punctuated by the sharp gaze of every neighbor in the room. We have gathered all the necessary evidence, and it's now time for the law to take its course. A collective sigh of relief spread through the crowd. It was over. But the most satisfying moment came when the deputy turned to the board members, their faces drawn and anxious, and gave them the news. You're all implicated. Your involvement in this criminal activity is undeniable. You are no longer protected by Karen. You will all be held accountable." The room fell silent, the weight of that statement settling heavily on everyone. The board members, those who had remained loyal to Karen for so long, suddenly looked small and insignificant. The once imposing figures who had controlled the neighborhood now seemed like nothing more than puppets caught in a web they could no longer escape. One by one, the remaining members were escorted out of the room for questioning, their faces pale, their heads hung low. The sheriff's deputies made it clear that no one was above the law, and now it was their turn to face the consequences of their actions. But the true climax of the day came when Karen, sitting in the back of the room, finally realized she was completely alone. Her defenses had crumbled, and there was no one left to protect her. The walls closed in. She stood up, suddenly her voice rising in desperation. "This isn't over. You have no idea who you're messing with. I built this community. You think you've won? You're wrong." But her words fell on deaf ears. The community now, united in their rejection of her and her actions, was unmoved by her outbursts. I watched as her once strong facade shattered completely. The deputies moved in, and Karen tried to push past them, but it was clear she had nowhere to run. "Karen Delaney, you are under arrest for the illegal disposal of hazardous waste, environmental destruction, fraud, and abuse of power," the sheriff said, his voice echoing through the room. "You'll be processed at the county jail. This is the beginning of your reckoning." Karen, now in handcuffs, finally lost her composure. She looked around the room with a mixture of rage and fear, realizing that the community she had controlled for so long had finally seen through her lies. The truth was no longer something she could suppress. She had lost everything, her power, her influence, and the one thing she valued most, her control. As the sheriff's deputies led her out of the building, the room erupted into applause. For the first time, in what felt like forever, the weight of the community's oppression was gone. The people who had been forced to live in fear were finally free. They had stood up to the injustice, and now, together, they could begin to rebuild. But Karen's downfall wasn't just about her arrest. It was about the end of a corrupt system that had thrived on manipulation and deceit. The HOA's reign of terror had come to a definitive end, and now the real work could begin rebuilding the community from the ground up. Karen's final words echoed in my mind, but they were meaningless now. The community had already won, and no matter how much she screamed or raged, it would never change the fact that her reign was over.